WECT's investigative reporter Ann McAdams has been following this since the start, since Mike Kelly's arrest in 2018. She joins us now with her exclusive interview. Ann?
Fran, this survivor, now an adult, was in the 9th grade when the crime started. Mike Tomaselli was willing to come forward to give other survivors a voice and to try to help us understand what went wrong so we can try to keep this from happening here again.
A former teacher is going to prison after pleading guilty to nearly 60 sex crimes charges involving his own students.
Mike Tomaselli attended Isaac Bear Early College High School from 2006 to 2010.
I had a difficult home life.
He had Mike Kelly's science class freshman year, and Mr. Kelly began to take a special interest in him. Tomaselli now understands that he and other boys in his class who looked to Kelly for support were targeted and then groomed.
It would start off simple with just inappropriate jokes, crude gestures, and just to make us feel special, like we were secluded, we were a part of the VIP group.
What started as crude jokes in the classroom turned into more lewd behavior in a smaller group.
It would escalate from the pornographic images to exposing himself, playing games, and having us expose ourselves. And he was really good at making it seem like it wasn't his idea. Making it seem like it's our game, that we're just letting him play.
While Tomaselli said things were never physical with him, he knows Kelly had sexual contact with some of his classmates.
I never sat down and thought about it long enough to think about the possibility of him getting in trouble, future investigation. I had to I put it away in a nice, neat little box and tried to never touch it again.
What eventually came out after Kelly's arrest in 2018, this had been going on for years.
I've done a lot of good work in the school system, and I've made some bad choices.
Tomaselli, 26 at the time of Kelly's arrest, was suddenly forced to reconsider the nature of his relationship with his favorite high school teacher from an adult perspective. After a painful and ongoing period coming to grips with what Kelly had done to him and others, Tomaselli came forward and was there for Kelly's guilty plea. He was not planning to speak out in court until he got there and heard the defense attorney asking for leniency for the former teacher of the year.
After a while, that got me angry. I tapped the prosecutor on the shoulder and I said, no, I changed my mind. I want to speak. Those same circumstances that were mentioned in the courtroom were the same kind of things that made this behavior go unchallenged for so long. After a while, I said no. That's what made me feel safe.
Kelly ultimately pleaded guilty to all charges, sentenced to 17 to 31 years in prison. While it was difficult, Tomaselli is now glad he spoke out.
Leaving the courtroom, I shook hands with about 7 different people. No idea who they were, but I could tell that this affected them, either parents or past victims, and they just said thank you, because that's something that needed to be said.
The community was still reeling from the growing number of victims coming forward in the Kelly case when news broke that another educator, Nicholas Oates, had been arrested for having sex with a former student. The 39-year-old was a former special education assistant at Myrtle Grove Middle School. He got the job with New Hanover County Schools in January 2016. Less than 1 year later, Nicholas Oates was suspended while the sheriff's office investigated sexually suggestive text messages Oates exchanged with a female student.
There were text messages sent between Oates and a student who was 12 when this relationship, which is totally the wrong word, but when this, abuse started, and she would later be 13 when they apparently allegedly consummated a sexual relationship.
Despite concerns, the text messages were not deemed criminal by investigators, and Oates was allowed back in the classroom. 6 weeks later, he was suspended again and able to resign. The schools provided no public explanation about what had happened. Their silence likely helped Oates land another job working with children.
He was hired. He did something that was, reprehensible, allegedly. He was allowed to resign without being fired, and then he went on to work with children again before he was arrested. And I think what motivated people, what resonated with people about this story was, how does that happen?
After his arrest, search warrants revealed the Myrtle Grove student had continued her relationship with Oates long after he left the school. The student told investigators they had exchanged nude photos, which she then deleted so her parents wouldn't find them. How extensively detectives searched her phone when Oates was first suspended is unclear, but sheriff's officials said they were unaware nude pictures had been shared when Oates was working for New Hanover County Schools. When Oates died, the sexual abuse case died with him, a devastating blow to the families who complained about Oates but never got their day in court. To this day, they are still waiting for answers.
Welcome back. In 2018, 2 New Hanover County teachers were arrested within 6 months of each other for sex crimes against their own students. The public started asking new questions about old arrests of other teachers from the school system who'd been charged with similar crimes. One of them, Richard Pretty, the former Laney High School band director. He resigned in 2001 and was later arrested for having a sexual relationship with a student in Charlotte.
Years before he left Laney High School, parents were complaining about Richard Pretty. While he was a talented band director, Barbara Burnett said she was concerned about how Pretty acted around his students.
Just inappropriate behavior and comments to the girls.
Burnett's daughter was in Pretty's class, trying to navigate how to respond to his odd behavior. Barbara said it ranged from Pretty's condescending comments in front of others to picking girls up under their arms and lifting them into the air.
I could see it. I was there. And her father witnessed some inappropriate physical interaction.
But things got much more serious when their daughter came home physically injured after a field trip with Mr. Pretty in 1999.
He hit her and left a bruise on her arm so deep that with a closed fist that I could see every knuckle from his fist. I was shocked.
Burnett started writing letters. So did her daughter and her ex-husband, alerting Principal Rick Holliday to the assault along with other disturbing behavior. Holliday responded to the girl's father, saying the concerns were legitimate and action had been taken. But Burnett said the obnoxious behavior continued. The following year, Burnett began sending letters to the school board and central office. Her ex-husband wrote Dr. Holliday that the inappropriate behavior had actually escalated, adding, quote, "I believe that Mr. Pretty is emboldened by a lack of appropriate action to his pattern of predatory behavior. This pattern of behavior and your inability to stop him creates a clear and present danger of sexual harassment that is intolerable."
Once the first victim came and they were protected, they felt safer with the second. And then they were protected. And it's just a giant snowball.
While the incident with her daughter was not a sexual assault, Burnett feels things got worse for other students because Pretty's behavior went unchecked. He was allowed to resign from New Hanover County Schools and went on to teach in Charlotte, where he was arrested and convicted for having a sexual relationship with one of his students there.
I'm not the type of person to say, "I told you so," but if I were, this would be the time I would do it.
Sadly, we are not finished. Jessica Wishnask, another Teacher of the Year, was also arrested in 2009 and accused of statutory rape of one of her students, a 15-year-old boy. An attorney who later filed a lawsuit against the schools on behalf of the boy's family said school administrators met with Wishnask and the student twice about their relationship, but never notified the boy's parents. Despite 2 suspensions and being observed in a locked classroom with a male student, the school system wrote Wishnask a letter of recommendation. She had moved on to another school district before the criminal charges from Wilmington caught up with her. As part of a plea deal, Wishnask served 4 years in prison and is now a registered sex offender. After filing a 2009 lawsuit against Wishnask and school administrators on behalf of the victim's family, attorney Troy Slaughter gave an interview to WECT.
The first goal is to make sure that this does not happen to another child in New Hanover County. That is our first goal. This did not have to happen.
Slaughter's comments eerily familiar to those made by attorneys and parents a decade later, after more teachers were arrested for similar crimes under the supervision of some of the same school administrators. Teachers like Peter Frank. He is sitting in jail tonight facing more than a dozen charges involving sex crimes against his students. In his case, we may have the clearest indicator yet that administrators knew.
Search warrants say there were notes in Peter Frank's personnel file showing that he'd been counseled about his inappropriate relationships with his young female students before being allowed back in the classroom. He's accused of performing a sex act on one of his students as early as 1999. After his arrest this year, former students say that in hindsight, his behavior and comments over the years were creepy.
I wasn't shocked at all. Being there for 3 years and being in band, it wasn't, everyone kind of knew things were weird or we had our own suspicions, but being 11, 12, 13, you don't really think a whole lot of those until you see it happen.
That former student said Frank made an inappropriate comment on a picture she posted on social media on her 21st birthday. The same attorneys who filed suit against the school system on behalf of Mike Kelly's victims have now filed suit for victims of Peter Frank.
None of the teachers or administrators mentioned in tonight's report would interview with us. This is the first of a 4-part special looking into what went wrong in the New Hanover County school system that allowed dozens of students to be taken advantage of by their teachers over a period of decades.
And you've heard from parents who say when they spoke up trying to stop the abuse, they actually faced retaliation.
Yes, John, families connected to the sexual abuse cases have said for years administrators knew about this abuse and covered it up. But parents who complained say it went farther than a cover-up, that administrators punished parents and students who dared to take a stand.
There's no excuse for it.
Carolyn Kubler tried for years to bring administrators' attention to disturbing behavior she learned about in her son's science class with Mike Kelly.
It's almost like they could care less. They're in power and they're in charge, and that's the way it is. And here's what we're going to do, and if you don't like it, too bad. Or if you don't like it, we're going to retaliate against you.
Kubler says she complained in person several times to Laney High School principal Rick Holliday in 2003 after hearing Kelly told sex jokes in class and even showed kids pornography. She says her complaints didn't stop the problem, but they did prompt retaliation against her teenage son.
He took 20 points off of each 2 of my child's tests for absolutely nothing. I thought it was the meanest thing to do. I came forward, not him.
After getting backlash at the high school level, Kubler says she appealed to central office and still has a copy of the complaint she filed over 15 years ago. Administrators claim to have no record of her complaint when Kelly was arrested in 2018. In addition to docking her son's science grade while he was applying to colleges, Kubler says the school got his driver's license suspended too. That's the exact complaint we heard from another parent who says his daughter's driver's license was suspended after he filed a Title IX complaint against the school system. He was upset the schools refused to enforce a court order to protect his daughter after she was sexually assaulted by another student. The parent, who asked not to be identified because of his job as a sheriff's deputy, says Assistant Superintendent Rick Holliday retaliated against him by calling the sheriff to question his mental state. He had a copy of an email where Holliday admitted it.
I still feel threatened. I still feel uncomfortable. I still feel as though there's always still that possibility that I may for false accusations be fired. I may be fired for simply advocating for what's right.
Holliday retired last summer, right after Mike Kelly pled guilty to dozens of sex crimes against students. Those crimes occurred when Holliday was Kelly's supervisor. Holliday's boss, former Superintendent Tim Markley, resigned in February, not long after being suspended by the school board for retaliating against another parent who'd complained. Clyde Edgerton says Markley called his employers at UNCW.
I think he deserves to be fired. I think any person who has a record like his of intimidation, cover-up, and corruption should be fired.
Another parent, Tori McLam, says she came forward 20 years ago after a music student she was tutoring confided that Laney High School band director Richard Pretty was making sexually inappropriate comments to her. McLam says then principal Rick Holliday dismissed her concerns. She says she really got the message that her attempts to help were unwelcome when she applied for one of several open music positions in the school system. She was highly qualified, but was not even granted an interview. Mr. Pretty, the band director she complained about, was able to resign from New Hanover County Schools before going on to teach in Charlotte, where he was arrested for having a sexual relationship with a student. Parent Barbara Burnett says her own daughter was physically, but not sexually, assaulted by Mr. Pretty when she was 14 years old. Burnett says school administrators did nothing to help her child. Instead, she says Pretty and Holliday purposely made her life difficult.
She did not complete her senior year at Laney High School. She had to get away from here. She was just being held back. She had done everything she could here, and she couldn't endure another year of roadblocks.
WECT investigative reporter Ann McAdams joins us now with the final part of this special report. And do we know how many victims there are in total?
Fran, we know of at least 25 victims left to pick up the pieces after being abused by teachers from their own schools. Tonight, they are looking forward at what changes need to happen to keep this from ever happening again.
Whenever victims are mentioned by the school board, it's alleged. We're not alleged. We are people who have been affected by this trauma, and calling us alleged is the same system that made it so easy for this to be swept under the rug in the first place.
For people like Mike Tomaselli, one of the named victims in the Mike Kelly sex abuse case, it has been a painful reckoning, learning he and his classmates were not the only students being abused by their teacher. It had been going on for decades, and the administrators in charge failed to stop it. Lots of people see things that may seem odd to them, but not everyone acts on their concerns. Carolyn Kubler, who is the first known whistleblower in the Mike Kelly case, says if something seems off with your child's teacher, it very likely is.
Dig deeper. You really have to dig deeper. If this is what's on the surface, and this is what's being transmitted, and this is what's going on, there very possibly could be something else outside of just what's going on in the classroom.
A common thread we saw with the parents who tried to bring attention to these problems: they didn't mind ruffling feathers when they say administrators tried to ignore them.
I went to every avenue I could go to, calling different law enforcement. You know, there's only so much a person can do.
While many feel new faces on the school board have been helpful turning the tide on decades of abuse, the current board members are not without their critics. In particular, victims and their families have been disturbed by the retirement parties and severance packages the administrators at the helm of this mess have received as they left the New Hanover County school system.
Having him walk away with the check before victims are even mentioned, I felt dehumanized.
The State Bureau of Investigation is still working on its case, looking into possible charges of failure to report. School officials are required by law to report suspected abuse of children to law enforcement. 2 civil lawsuits against New Hanover County schools and former top administrators are ongoing.